There's something that's been on my mind lately, and maybe it's something that some of you might be able to benefit from. And it's this concept of balancing creative liberty with creative restriction. And what I mean by that is on the creative liberty side, a lot of times with our personal projects, we have total creative control. Our imagination is the limit. And there are factors like budget and cast and crew size that do play a role in determining if the project can even take place. But for the most part, if you can line all those things up, whatever you can think of or imagine creatively, you can actually put into practice and make. And that's where you see some of the really cool art pieces that come out from some creators, just really interesting, new, cutting edge creative projects can come from that space where you have total liberty, total freedom, and you're not really accountable to anyone else's vision. Now, that's very rarely a possibility because of those different factors that I mentioned, budget, cast, crew, etc. So many different things. And that's where things end up falling more into creative restriction, where maybe you are working for a client, or you have a small budget, or you don't have a big crew, or you can't get a professional cast. Those kind of restrictions that are placed on the project end up hindering or stifling your creativity, and you're put in a situation where you have to maybe kind of stretch your budget or flex your imagination a little bit, where it's not quite what you had envisioned, but it's close or close enough for what you wanted to do. Those are situations that I think are really beneficial because those challenges, those obstacles that are put in place, it takes another level of creativity to overcome them. If you have an infinite budget, there's so much you can do, but how much can you do with the budget you're given? Maybe you only have $100, $1,000, $10,000. I don't know what it is, but you might be limited in that respect, or you only have a crew of 2 people or 20 people, and that's somehow a limitation. Those are situations that you can improvise and figure out new and unique ways to solve problems that someone else might just throw money at or might just throw people at. And you can actually make some really cool stuff with those restrictions. I think some of the best stuff that I've ever made has come with restrictions applied. Now, sometimes there's restrictions that really do hurt the overall project, and those are things that you sometimes can't get around. A client who wants to do it one particular way and it's their vision and it totally contradicts your vision, but they're paying the bill, so you've got to do what they say, and that's fine. That's the nature of business and how it works. And so there's this balance between the restrictions that get placed on something, but then constantly or frequently wanting the liberty that comes with doing stuff on your own. So what can be really valuable for some people is to do client work or do work that has restrictions, and then do stuff that's personal, and you can kind of do what you want, you can make what you want, you have that total freedom. It's valuable to do both, and here's why. If you only do the stuff that's your personal work, where you have total freedom to do whatever it is you want to do, it doesn't really stretch you or challenge you like those restrictions can. And I think you're probably familiar with numerous examples of people who are really respected, who have been able to produce things with restrictions. A famous story is one of the go-tos is George Lucas in the original Star Wars. There were so many restrictions put on him for the original Star Wars, and things he couldn't do, things he had to cut back just because of the budget, or other producers who were involved said, no, we're not going to do that. So it forced him into this, restriction category of making it work with the box that he was put in. And then you compare the original Star Wars with some of the stuff where he was able to just go nuts and do his entire vision. And you get some of the prequels, and people aren't necessarily a fan of those. Now, maybe you disagree with that, but it is an example of what I'm talking about, where the restrictions, some would argue, helped the project, where someone having total creative freedom to do whatever they want didn't actually turn out that well. So, embracing some of those restrictions sometimes, and stretching yourself and pushing yourself to overcome those hurdles and work with others and figure things out is very valuable. And those client projects where it needs to be done a specific way with specific aesthetics that matches the brand style, and you can't go crazy with it, it's got to fit in this little box, you can still be creative in that space. It's just a little bit more restricted, and so you can actually make that work. But if you're only doing that, if you're only working on client stuff, you can end up getting in a pattern where you're kind of rinse and repeat, doing the same things over and over again, falling into patterns or bad habits, or just becoming kind of lazy, where you think you're being creative, but what you're doing is you're closing the box smaller and smaller in upon yourself because you're so used to working that one way. This can be common with people who do the same thing over and over again, people who do weddings, or they do comedy sketches, or they do music videos. They find a style, they find something that they like, and then that's what they do over and over and over again. And I think after a while that can be not as rewarding as you might want it to be. And it's not that it's bad or good, it's just I think something that you have to be aware of and be conscious of, so you can recognize those moments and then take time to shift to the other side and do something that's more personal, where you have more liberty, you have freedom to do whatever it is that you want. Maybe you see something in your mind that you're like, it'd be really cool to get this kind of shot. I don't really have a client project that I could do that for. I'm just going to make up my own project and do that shot. That's that creative liberty side, and you can get fired up again, you can find motivation, and you can get your passion back in some cases when you go to that liberty side. But spend too much time over there, and then all of a sudden your ideas don't have any time to be refined. There's no one else kind of polishing those ideas, and you might just go a little too crazy, and it might not be something that resonates with people the way you want it to. Sometimes you have to bounce those ideas off other people to get their feedback and see, is this sending the message that I want? And so finding that balance can be tricky, but if you're aware of it and you recognize which camp you fall into, you can start looking at opportunities in the other one. Because if you're totally free doing, short films, independent films, all on your own, that's all you do, and you don't have accountability to anyone else, you can recognize that and say, hey, maybe I should go do some paid work for a client, or, do something that kind of stretches me a little bit, do some kind of commercial in an industry that I'm not even familiar with. Those moments where you can recognize those opportunities are really, really valuable. And that way you can find that balance between the two. And I think the more you do of both, the better. There's kind of like this cross-pollination effect, where the more you work with restrictions, it can actually make your liberty side better, and vice versa. And you can kind of just go back and forth and play off of each other. So that's just something that I've been thinking about. I don't know if that resonates with any of you. I hope it does. I hope it makes sense, the idea that I'm trying to convey. It doesn't matter which one you do. They're not good or bad. It's just different ways of working, different types of projects, things that we find ourselves doing. So if you find yourself doing too much on one side, you can end up feeling maybe a little bit tired, maybe a little exhausted, like you're just burning your wheels, like going nowhere. So just kind of recognize that. If you ever find yourself in a funk, it might just be time to kind of switch up the kind of work you're doing and maybe give yourself some challenges or give yourself some freedom. Who knows? It depends on you and how you work in your projects, but I'd be curious to see what you think. You can always leave me a comment. I check them all the time. But just something I wanted to share. I thought it was maybe an interesting perspective that people might not always recognize. I think it's always there in the back of our minds, especially those limitations. The restrictions can be, challenging, but in a fun way to work with. And so I think those are always there. But I think there's also that other side that's kind of dangerous to fall into, where it's just too much freedom can actually be a bad thing when it comes to creativity sometimes.